It's Croctober, the official celebration of Crocs fans like you. So whether you like to rock your classic clogs, get cozy and fuss-lined, personalize with your favorite Jibbitz charms, or even, dress up like a clog for Halloween, it's time to tell your story and share your style. Join the Croctober celebration with Crocs fans around the world. Go to crocs.com to discover the range of shoes and find a pair that's iconic like you. Crocs, celebrating you all month long.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means. It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop early holiday deals now.
Welcome to the Murder Diaries. I'm Natalie.
And I'm Paige. Today's episode is a little bit different, but so fitting for the topics that we discuss on the Murder Diaries, both in our episodes and on social media. The Salem Witch Trials. Fun fact, I, Paige, am related to one of the few men that were on trial at the Salem Witch Trials, and he actually survived. To find out more about who I'm related to, tune in to the next episode of Journal Entries, which we release every other Monday.
In January of 1692, two young girls in Salem Village, Massachusetts, 9-year-old Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, started behaving in ways that left everyone shocked. They were having these wild fits, barking like dogs and speaking in strange, incomprehensible words. Betty's dad, Reverend Samuel Paris, who was the town's Puritan minister, became convinced that something supernatural was at play. What followed in Salem was one of the most infamous episodes of mass hysteria and injustice in American history, with the courts operating under a chilling, guilty until proven innocent mindset. Tensions ran high, the community was swept up in fear, and things just spiraled out of control. This is the story of the Salem Witch Trials.
Used to think it's in my head, but I'm walking with the dead.
In the late 17th century, Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was one of the original English settlements, was being held in a strong grip by the Puritans. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Puritans were a very strict group of Protestants who intended to purify the Church of England from everything that they viewed as being corrupt practices. They were extremely religious and very devout in their beliefs. This is why it was so upsetting and concerning to the community when young Betty and Abigail began displaying behavior that seemed to be otherworldly. The girls had played a fortune-telling game where they'd drop an egg white into a glass of water. Legend had it that the egg white would take a form that would predict who the girls would marry and what their future would look like. The girls saw the egg white turn into the shape of a coffin, and they hysterically began crying, uncontrollably shouting, and contorting violently. Betty's father and Abigail's uncle, Reverend Paris, began praying and fasting, hoping that he could cure the girls of their strange behavior and possible possession. The children's caregiver, an indigenous woman named Tituba, also tried to help the girls by baking them a cake of rye meal and urine, known as a witch cake. And for a little background on Tituba, she was enslaved by the Paris family after the Reverend bought her in Barbados as a teenager, then brought her to Massachusetts. Now, when Reverend Paris heard about what Tituba had done, he beat her until she confessed that Betty and Abigail's strange behavior was a result of witchcraft, and that she'd been instructed to hurt the girls and that she was doing all of this in service of the devil. With this, panic set in, and the town of Salem was set ablaze with accusations of witchcraft.
Other young girls in town, including 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard and 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., joined in on the strange behavior and accusations of being possessed by witchcraft. With the town's doctor confirming the suspicions of witchcraft causing the girls' behavior, the rest of the community became convinced that the devil himself was targeting their Puritan way of life. Tituba's confession grew and became more detailed the more she was questioned. She said that not only had she been practicing witchcraft, she'd also been part of a witches' coven, along with several other local women. Specifically, Tituba named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Sarah Good, who was approximately 39 years old at the time of her accusation, was married with several children. Her family was poor and didn't have a good social standing within the community. There were reportedly many people who had also had personal problems with Good. Despite intense pressure, Good refused to confess to being involved in witchcraft. Sarah Osborne, who was in her late 40s, was said to be ill and an outcast. She was likely suffering from what we would call today depression. She was looked down upon by the town because her second husband was her former servant, and there were reports that the two had lived as husband and wife before they'd actually been married. Both of these accusations were in direct contrast with Puritan beliefs. On February 29, 1692, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Good, Osborne, and Tituba, and the three women were brought to court to face the accusations against them.
Good was the first of the three women to testify in the first of the Salem Witchcraft Trials. Bernard Rosenthal wrote in Salem's story that Good was chosen as the first to testify because they believed there would be the least amount of resistance to getting her out of Salem. During the trial, her 6-year-old daughter was even brought to the stand to testify against her, encouraged only by fear. Good's husband also testified, and while he didn't specifically accuse Good of being a witch, he said that he had reason to believe that she might be practicing witchcraft. It's been speculated that it's very likely he said this simply to separate himself from the terrifying accusations against his wife. When Good was finally allowed to speak for herself, she vehemently denied the accusations of being a witch or practicing witchcraft, demanding that she was falsely accused. However, after the girls who'd accused them of witchcraft fell to the floor during the trial and began convulsing, Good accused Sarah Osborne of causing the girls' behavior. In a paper written by Sarah Jobe for the University of Virginia on the Salem Witch Trials, Jobe wrote, "Historians generally agree that this accusation by Good was one of the first and strongest legitimizations of the witchcraft trials." Osborne denied any involvement in witchcraft, and unlike Good and Tituba, didn't accuse anyone else of witchcraft. In fact, she defended herself by asserting the claim that Satan could take the shape of anything or anyone, even without their permission.
Initially, Tituba tried to deny the accusations. However, she ultimately gave in to her interrogator, Salem Town Justice John Hawthorne. In a Smithsonian Magazine article, Stacy Schiff wrote, Hawthorne asked the first suspects whom they employed to hurt the girls. The question went to Tituba with a different spin. "The devil came to me," she revealed, "and bid me serve him." As an enslaved person, she could not so easily afford to sound a defiant note. After this, Tituba began to weave a tale about the devil, his accomplices, and a man who came to her and ordered her to harm the children. The story changed several times, becoming more and more exuberant. Regarding Tituba's testimony, Schiff wrote, quote, "She submitted a vivid, lurid, and harebrained report. More than anyone else, she propelled America's infamous witch hunt forward, supplying its imagery and determining its shape. While she was hauntingly specific, she was also gloriously vague." End quote. Yes, one could argue that if Tituba hadn't provided such a convincing and detailed confession, the trials and accusations might not have escalated. However, her stories provided exactly what the accusers wanted, so who could blame her for trying to get them off her back? Schiff's article goes on to say that confessions to witchcraft were rare, convincing, satisfying, and the most kaleidoscopically colorful of the century. Tituba's changed everything. It assured authorities they were on the right track. Doubling the number of suspects, it stressed the urgency of the investigation, It encouraged the authorities to arrest additional suspects. A satanic conspiracy was afoot.
Both Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were found guilty by a jury of their peers. Good's execution was pushed due to her being pregnant, and unfortunately, her newborn died while in prison with her. Good's 6-year-old daughter was also imprisoned for 7 months due to accusations of witchcraft. She was ultimately released, but the trauma of what she'd been through would be lasting. Good was executed by hanging on July 19th, 1692. Some reports say that while standing at the gallows, Good was asked once more if she wanted to confess her crimes. Sarah Job's article for the University of Virginia that we referenced earlier reads, "Far from confessing, Good is said to have screamed, 'You're a liar. I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take my life away, God will give you blood to drink.'" Much like Good, Osborne continued to deny being a witch or involved in any sort of dealings with the devil. She also refused to accuse anyone else. Osborne died in prison on May 10th, 1692, before she could be executed. As for Tituba, she was put in jail, but she was never executed. And while the exact reason why she wasn't put to death like many of the other accused, it's assumed that it's because she continued to confess her involvement, as well as accuse others of witchcraft and contribute to the town's growing fear of a demonic presence in their community. So even though her stories terrified the townspeople, it seemed to also assure them that they were on the right track.
When I was in grad school, I worked part-time. I didn't make much, but it covered my expenses like gas, meals, small bills. And whenever I'd have a little money left over, I'd go full treat yourself mode. But when I look back at that time, I realized I missed so many opportunities to be investing in my future. Because as I know now, you can't beat time in the market. Thankfully, I do know better now. That's why I'm so excited that today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invest your money for you. Nowadays, when I have a little bit of extra money, it goes straight into my Acorns account. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean I don't treat myself. I'm just more aware of where my money's going. I'm so grateful that my money has a chance to grow with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/diaries or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/diaries.
This episode is brought to you in part by Quince. I'm so excited it's fall, but that means all the tank tops, all the summer and spring clothes are getting shuffled out, and all of the fall sweaters and all of the fall cozies are coming out. Some of my favorite cozy pieces are from Quince, including this adorable organic cotton sweater that I have. So I'll be wearing that to work pretty much all fall and winter.
Quince is also known for their Mongolian cashmere sweaters that start at $50. And it's not just that. All Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands.
Let's talk about how and why Quince is able to have such affordable prices for such high quality items and fabrics like cashmere. They partner directly with top factories, and that allows them to cut out the cost of the middleman. They pass those savings on to us with better pricing. And by the way, Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece, from their organic cotton to their cashmere. I already mentioned the sweater I have that I love to live in colder weather, but I also have a cotton t-shirt that I love and a cashmere t-shirt that I get compliments every single time I wear it to work. It's a beautiful maroon color, and honestly, I just can't say enough good things about the Quince pieces that I have in my closet.
Get cozy in Quince's high-quality wardrobe essentials. Go to quince.com/diaries for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/diaries to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/diaries.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number. and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Shortly after Good and Osborne's fates were decided in court, the young women who'd reportedly been victims of witchcraft accused yet another woman of being a witch. Rebecca Nurse was an elderly woman who, unlike the previously accused, was well respected in the town of Salem. As the hysteria and fear continued to consume the town, it took less and less for accusations to be taken seriously and for people to join in. Things as minor as tension between neighbors could lead to an accusation of witchcraft. Rebecca and many friends and neighbors who testified against her character protested the accusations against her. In June of 1692, Rebecca was tried in court. Her accuser, Abigail Williams, told the magistrates that just earlier that morning, an apparition of Rebecca came to her and afflicted her. Just after this, another accuser, Ann Putnam Jr., began to have a fit in court. The trial had hardly begun, but it seemed that most people were already convinced of Rebecca's guilt. Rebecca denied the accusations in court, saying, "I can say before my eternal Father, I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." Two more accusers came forward. This time, both were adult males in the community and spoke of Rebecca's involvement in witchcraft. An article written by Matt Madden explains how several more young girls joined in accusing Rebecca during the trial and made a scene in the courtroom. Quote, "Then the girls, with their eyes on Rebecca's agitated movements, imitated her postures by contorting their own bodies. Thus, they made it appear that Rebecca implicated herself as the afflicted cried out in pain with every movement, gaining the attention of the judges and the onlookers." Surprisingly, the jury initially returned with the verdict of not guilty. They were strongly advised to reconsider and then came back with a guilty verdict. On July 3rd, Rebecca was excommunicated from her church. Just a few days prior, she was sentenced to death upon her conviction of witchcraft. On July 19th, Rebecca was executed by hanging. As she stood on the gallows just before her death, it's said that Rebecca continued to remain a model of Christian behavior.
As the number of women being accused of witchcraft increased, the number of girls who had reportedly been afflicted by these so-called witches increased as well. Historian Peter Hoffer said that the girls turned themselves from a circle of friends into a gang of juvenile delinquents. Their behavior also continued to escalate, with wild outbursts during court proceedings where they'd speak in words that no one could understand and contort their bodies into strange positions. They'd complain of feeling pain, sensations of pinching and biting when no one was touching them. This was all, of course, attributed to witchcraft. The timeline going forward changes a bit depending on which publication is consulted, but the events themselves remain the same. The first few accusations of witchcraft were merely scraping the surface. The town of Salem wasn't only just frightened by the belief that the devil was now present in their community. They were obsessed. It was the only thing on the minds of those in the town, which made the threshold for accusing others of witchcraft almost non-existent. Though it's commonly assumed that only women were accused of witchcraft during this time, there were actually several men who stood trial. Giles Corey was 80 years old when he was first accused of witchcraft. He and his wife Martha were among the townspeople who attended the court proceedings for the first accused. Martha was one of the only people in town to vocalize her doubts about the accusations of witchcraft. Martha tried to convince Giles not to attend further proceedings, even going as far as to hide his horse saddle so he couldn't ride to court. Unfortunately, this behavior was immediately suspicious to the townspeople, and despite her upstanding reputation, Martha was accused of witchcraft. One of the accusers, Ann Putnam Jr., added that Martha's spirit had attacked her. According to the First Amendment Encyclopedia, the Puritans believed physical realizations had spiritual causes. For example, if the crops failed, the devil may have played a role. So with this worldview, it wasn't a stretch for them to accept spectral evidence of spirits and visions which was the primary evidence used as proof of guilt during the Salem Witch Trials. Now, back to Martha. 2 men decided to take it upon themselves to investigate her personally. They went to Anne, asking her what Martha's spirit had been wearing. They planned to go to Martha's house afterwards and find her wearing the same thing. But Anne couldn't answer them. She said that the spirit had temporarily blinded her so she couldn't see what she was wearing. When the 2 men went to Martha's home afterwards, they still had no proof. But they found her responses and tone to be an intolerable blend of smugness, contempt, and mockery. Not only was she guilty in their eyes, but impudent as well.
Giles, Martha's husband, didn't hesitate to testify against his wife, backing up the accusations. Several others testified against her, and Martha was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to death. Strangely enough, Giles actually ended up trying to recant his testimony against Martha, possibly now having realized that his words played a part in his wife's sentencing. Giles' apparent admission of perjury was immediately taken as a sign that he was also involved in witchcraft. The First Amendment Encyclopedia explained bearing false witness and committing perjury were considered felonies in Salem. Under normal conditions, those convicted of such charges were prosecuted in public forums. During the witch trials, however, individuals convicted of perjury could save themselves from public humiliation by accusing their neighbors. Giles was no stranger to being in trouble with the law. About 15 years prior, Giles, quote, pummeled a farm worker to death. He was found guilty of murder, but shockingly, only had to pay a fine. Giles went to court on the charges of witchcraft and pleaded not guilty, however, refused to actually be involved in the trial. Because of this, there was no chance of him being able to be found not guilty. According to the law at the time, Giles was considered to be a standing mute, and his punishment was decided to be something other than death by hanging. Giles was to be pressed to death, despite this being illegal. In September of 1692, large stones were continuously placed across a board that was laid across Giles's chest. With each stone, more and more pressure was added until eventually Giles was crushed to death. Just a few days later, Martha was hanged at the gallows. According to research by Heather Snyder in an article written for the University of Virginia, in the entire history of the United States, Giles Corey is the only person ever to be pressed to death by order of a court.
Bridget Bishop, who was believed to be in her 60s, became the person who had the most accusations against her during the trials. And despite this, it wasn't necessarily the amount of accusers that solidified her guilt in the eyes of the community. It was Bridget's purported flamboyant lifestyle and exotic manner of dress that truly brought suspicions upon her. Bridget was said to often be the subject of gossip due to her fighting publicly with all 3 of her husbands, having guests in her home until the late evening hours, drinking alcohol and playing shovelboard, and frequenting 2 busy town taverns. Townspeople said that Bridget's moral character was questionable, which was clearly a danger to the young people in the town. But let's call it like it is. Essentially, Bridget didn't adhere to the Puritan lifestyle, which was clear evidence to the community of her involvement in witchcraft. Not only did the young girls in the community testify against Bridget, but her sister's husband even told the courts that Bridget had been possessed by the devil and that she'd stayed up all night talking to the devil. Bridget was charged, tried, and executed by hanging within 8 days.
To many, the accused seemed random. Some of them were upstanding members of the community, well-respected and church-going. Others were less valued in the community, some even considered to be outcasts. One of the biggest contributors to the accusations, investigations, and court proceedings was the Putnam family. Thomas Putnam, head of the Putnam family, was a prominent figure in the Salem Village community. He was good friends with the Parris family, including Reverend Samuel Parris. The Reverend's daughter Betty and niece Abigail were the first to instigate accusations of witchcraft against Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Shortly after this, Ann Putnam Jr. joined in on the accusations of witchcraft, joining her friends in the courtroom during the trials and exhibiting cursed behavior. Ultimately, Abigail ended up accusing at least 57 people of witchcraft throughout the duration of the trials. Anne named and testified more than 60 people. Abigail was just 11 years old and Anne was 12. Though it may have seemed random, many of the accused and executed had a history of social disagreements with either the Putnam or the pair's families. In several of the cases, the accusers stood to gain property from those they accused of witchcraft. The two families were significant in creating and fanning the fire of witchcraft accusations, trials, and executions.
One of those who seemed to be accused based largely off his disagreements with the Putnam family was George Burroughs. Some even considered him to be the ringleader of the accused. George lived in Salem Village and ministered for 2 years, but left after a dispute about his pay. Professor Douglas O. Linder wrote in an article that the pay didn't seem to be the only reason George left. He seemed also to have had a more personal and heated dispute over money with John Putnam. As a result of these disputes, Burroughs left the village abruptly. After he left Salem Village, he moved around a bit and ultimately landed in Wells, Maine. George was working as a minister in Wells and had been for 9 years when he was taken from his dinner table while eating and brought back to Salem to stand trial for accusations of witchcraft. George's accusation and trials was said to be the most dramatic escalation of judicial action in the early phases of the trials. Multiple people testified against George, with one even saying that he was the leader, the conjurer, above all the witches. The testimonies that contributed most to George's ultimate convocation was by several of the self-confessed witches. They said that George was Satan's personal representative at Salem witch meetings. They even referred to him as Sorcerer Burroughs. Ann Putnam Jr. told the court that 2 women, who she said were George's dead wives, visited her and told her about the abuse that they'd suffered from George. Though he had a wealth of supposed evidence against him, George still managed to have 32 very respected community members petition on behalf of his innocence. But of course, it didn't matter. George stood on the gallows, yelling that he was innocent and reciting the Lord's Prayer, which was confusing to the townspeople because it was believed that he'd be unable to recite it so easily if he was in fact a wizard. Spectators called for him to be pardoned, but the officials refused and George was hanged, along with several other accused witches.
The pattern of evidence presented against the accused in court continued, with all convictions being based heavily, if not fully, on spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is legal evidence based upon the testimony of those who can claim to have experienced visions. Mary Daniel testified in court that Rowley, Massachusetts resident Margaret Scott's spirit had appeared before her one night, causing her to fall ill. Mary said that the spirit attacked her and pulled her to the ground while pinching her. Margaret was found guilty and executed shortly after. Mary Eastie was initially convicted after, like in many Salem witch trials, several of the girls who were accusers broke out in fits in her presence. She was sent to prison and for many unknown reasons was released after 2 months. This was very upsetting to the girls who had accused Mary. The girls began telling people that Mary's spirit had visited them, with one saying the spirit had strangled them. Funnily enough, when Mary was reapprehended and placed back in jail, the fits that the girls had been having since her release suddenly stopped. Mary continued to profess her innocence, but was convicted and executed by hanging.
As the number of accused continued to climb, and officials brought one supposed witch after another to the gallows, some in the village began to question the legitimacy of the claims. So many people that were considered respectable and upstanding by the community had been found guilty. Reverend John Hale said, "It cannot be imagined that in a place of so much knowledge, so many in so small a compass of land should abominably leap into the devil's lap at once." Throughout the trials, Minister Cotton Mather had repeatedly warned the town and court officials about how questionable it was to use testimonies about dreams and vision to convict people. Unfortunately, no one listened. His father, Increase Mather, the president of Harvard College, strongly encouraged others to listen to his son. And according to a History.com article, Increase argued that the standards of evidence for witchcraft must be equal to those of any other crime, concluding that it would be better than 10 suspected witches may escape than one innocent person be condemned. Increased Mather was accompanied by Sir William Phips upon his return to Salem Village. With Increase's influence, William was appointed to be the first royal governor of the colony. When they arrived, the town was about 2 months into the Salem Witch Trials. Governor Phips' first course of action was to create the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine. This court was responsible for trying and going through the enormous backlog of cases of people who were currently imprisoned upon accusations of witchcraft. Governor Phips placed William Stoughton in charge of this court, which ended up being one of the governor's biggest mistakes. Stoughton looked for guilt in all of those accused of witchcraft, regardless of whether there was any actual evidence. And in an article written for the University of Virginia, Brenda Dignan wrote, Phips failed to recognize from the beginning the problems associated with the trials. Most notably that innocent people were being convicted and executed on the basis of spectral evidence.
Governor Phips left town for several months for Maine. Upon his return to Salem, he quickly recognized that the court was making serious mistakes in their judgments and actions. At the height of the accusations, and what was considered to be the deadliest day of the trials in late September of 1692, 7 women and 1 man were hanged in one day after being convicted as witches. Governor Phips immediately pardoned 8 people, of whom Stoughton had already sentenced to death. More and more of the accused began to be released from jail and were pardoned from their charges. In early 1693, the governor closed down the court and stopped the trials. By the time that the trials ended, a total of 19 convicted witches had been executed at the gallows. Approximately 4 had died in prison, and 1 man, who we spoke about earlier, was pressed to death. Over 160 people had been accused and imprisoned during the witch trials. 2 dogs were even executed after being suspected accomplices to the witches. Samuel Sewall was one of the 9 judges who had been appointed to the court when created by the governor. He had a respected reputation in the community and was well respected in the church. He was present for most of the trials, contributing to the sentences and ultimate execution of many of the townspeople. Sewall ultimately ended up issuing a public apology and confession of guilt. He said that the court's decisions and judgments were sadly diluted and mistaken. Every year following, Sewall set aside a day to pray and fast for forgiveness for his role in the trials. After Sewall's apology, many other people came forward, including other judges and even some of the accusers, to express their regret and ask for forgiveness. Len Niehoff, a professor at the University of Michigan's Law School, noted that despite the regret that some felt, the trials and the executions weren't the end of the witchcraft suspicions. Quote, "It's important to note that the trials didn't end because people stopped believing in witches. They ended because the people stopped believing that the trials were doing an effective job at identifying who the witches were."
The impact felt from the Salem Witch Trials reached far beyond the people involved. It spurred changes in the court of law in hopes of not repeating the mistakes made in Salem. When people faced the jury and their accusations during the trials, they were immediately assumed to be guilty. This led to the current process of the U.S. criminal justice system, that all accused have the right of being innocent until proven guilty. The trials in Salem relied not only on spectral evidence to convict, but almost all testimony was what would now be considered hearsay. Professor Niehoff explained why this eventually led to hearsay being ruled as inadmissible in court, saying that it now plays a critical role in ensuring that the evidence admitted is reliable and is based on the personal knowledge of the witnesses. It prevents the admission of rumors, assumptions, and community gossip, precisely the sorts of things that drove the Salem trials. Missing from all of the Salem trials were defense lawyers. None of the accused had counsel to object while they were being questioned, or to cross-examine those who testified. Professor Niehoff wrote that most of the witnesses against the accused witches could have been very effectively challenged. Now, would any of this have changed the outcomes of the trials? It's difficult to speculate, especially being that much of the hysteria surrounding the accusations and convictions wasn't as much rooted in the trial proceedings, but in the courts of public opinion.
By May of 1693, Governor Phipps had pardoned and released all of those left in prison on witchcraft charges. In 1711, the state of Massachusetts passed legislation that exonerated all who had been accused as witches and paid restitution to them and their families. Regarding what the country learned from the mass hysteria of the Salem Witch Trials, Professor Niehoff wrote, "The trials are filled with cautionary tales about how catastrophically bad things can go when legal proceedings fail to offer certain minimum guarantees. They also provide a perpetual reminder of the consequences of fear unchecked by the sort of reasoned judgment that the law demands." Despite the well-recognized deadly mistakes that were made during the 1600s in Salem Village, witch hunts are still something that continue to this day. These are largely found in Africa, the Pacific, and Latin America. There are even reports among immigrant communities in Western Europe and the U.S. United Nations refugee and human rights agencies have found that thousands of murders are committed each year under the accusations of victims being witches. A 2010 UNICEF study found an increase in violence and child abuse that was linked to accusations of witchcraft. It wasn't until 1971 that Papua New Guinea finally reversed a law that, quote, permitted attackers to cite intent to combat witchcraft as legal defense. Unfortunately, this didn't stop the 2013 murder of a 20-year-old Papua New Guinea woman accused of sorcery. She was burned alive by a violent mob. Others have been beaten, stoned to death, or even beheaded. A New York Times article written by Mitch Horowitz details the incredible extremes that are still taken in some countries. In his article, Mitch quotes one of Nigeria's most popular Pentecostal preachers, Helen Ukpabio. The quote is as follows: "If a child under the age of 2 screams in the night, cries, and is always feverish with deteriorating health, he or she is a servant of Satan." Mitch goes on to write that this implies children in those communities are especially likely to be identified as possessed. According to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the majority of the 25 to 50,000 children who are unhoused and living on the streets of the Democratic Republic of Congo's capital city were abandoned by their family members after being accused of witchcraft or being possessed by demons.
In 2011, Saudi Arabian courts sentenced 2 individuals to be beheaded after being tried and convicted of sorcery. In 2013, this same court sentenced 2 maids for casting spells against their employers. They were punished with 1,000 lashes and 10 years in prison. In 2012, it was reported that police in London had investigated 81 cases of ritual abuse over the past 10 years. The abuse was of children who'd been accused of demonic possession or witchcraft. A 15-year-old boy was tortured and murdered in East London by his older sister and her boyfriend. They accused him of being a sorcerer after he wet his bed. And in response to this case, the British police started to receive special training on witchcraft-related abuse. In 2014, a man in Queens, New York was arrested after beating his girlfriend and her daughter to death. He explained that the women were both witches and had been casting spells on him. Though the Salem Witch Trials officially ended in May of 1693, the accusations and brutality have continued. In Horowitz's New York Times article, he reiterates the importance of recognizing and acting on these crimes in order to prevent them, writing, "Most important, witchcraft-related violence should be branded as hate crimes by international courts and by all jurisdictions where anti-hate statutes exist. This is vital to gaining wider recognition of this criminality and preventing it. In too many places, the accusation of witchcraft has become an incitement to mob violence. It's time to lay the ghosts of Salem to rest."
Make sure to follow us on all of our socials and subscribe on Apple or Patreon so that you can listen ad-free, early, and get access to our journal entries episodes.
And until then,
stay safe.
bye.
When I was in grad school, I worked part-time. I didn't make much, but it covered my expenses like gas, meals, small bills. And whenever I'd have a little money left over, I'd go full treat yourself mode. But when I look back at that time, I realized I missed so many opportunities to be investing in my future. Because as I know now, you can't beat time in the market. Thankfully, I do know better now. That's why I'm so excited that today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invest your money for you. Nowadays, when I have a little bit of extra money, it goes straight into my Acorns account. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean I don't treat myself. I'm just more aware of where my money's going. I'm so grateful that my money has a chance to grow with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/diaries or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/diaries.
This episode is brought to you in part by Quince. I'm so excited it's fall, but that means all the tank tops, all the summer and spring clothes are getting shuffled out, and all of the fall sweaters and all of the fall cozies are coming out. Some of my favorite cozy pieces are from Quince, including this adorable organic cotton sweater that I have. So I'll be wearing that to work pretty much all fall and winter.
Quince is also known for their Mongolian cashmere sweaters that start at $50. And it's not just that. All Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands.
Let's talk about how and why Quince is able to have such affordable prices for such high quality items and fabrics like cashmere. They partner directly with top factories, and that allows them to cut out the cost of the middleman. They pass those savings on to us with better pricing. And by the way, Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece, from their organic cotton to their cashmere. I already mentioned the sweater I have that I love to live in colder weather, but I also have a cotton t-shirt that I love and a cashmere t-shirt that I get compliments every single time I wear it to work. It's a beautiful maroon color, and honestly, I just can't say enough good things about the Quince pieces that I have in my closet.
Get cozy in Quince's high-quality wardrobe essentials. Go to quince.com/diaries for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/diaries to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/diaries.